Welcome to the first session. Beneficiary outreach is all about communicating with the people who your programs serve. Now, communication needs to be a two-way street. You're communicating with them, but you also want to hear back from them about how they're doing, what they need, and what's changing. During this COVID-19 time, a lot of NGOs, programs, and objectives even are changing. Things are being canceled, timelines are moving around, and people are moving around. It's tempting to not communicate with your beneficiaries. Some NGOs are feeling like they don't have time or they're not able to communicate with their beneficiaries. But there are three good reasons why you should be communicating with your beneficiaries during COVID-19 and why this may be a time when you especially want to communicate with your beneficiaries. Number one, a lot of your beneficiaries are feeling uncertainty right now. They may not know what's happening with their own lives, what their own future is, or how your NGO is going to be able to help them and serve them in the future. Number two, a lot of beneficiaries need to navigate changes in your programs. They need to know what's happening with your NGO. Are your services changing? Is something going to change in the timeline? Number three, they finally have time to watch some of your messages. During COVID, a lot of people are staying at home, they have time to read, they have time to watch videos, and they're tuning in to some of the news from NGOs like you. Beneficiary communication is a lot like customer communication in the corporate world. In the corporate world, there's a kind of outdated business model where you think that there's a product and the product leads directly to profits. More stuff, more money. But that's outdated because there's a step that this misses. That missing piece is, of course, the customer. Customers in a corporate situation go through an entire journey where they start off trying a product, then they become someone who's buying it regularly, they start to prefer that product, they become exclusive to that product, and finally they can become an advocate of that product. All along the way, the company is making money from those sales. NGOs go through a similar beneficiary journey, and in our next session, we're going to talk about that beneficiary journey in some more detail. But first, let's talk about that product, customer, revenue model in an NGO context where we think about your beneficiaries and who they are. In an NGO context, we don't really have products, although we might. We normally talk about the programs that an NGO produces. This is the work that you do. Well, who are you selling to? Well, we're not really selling to customers, of course. Our programs are for beneficiaries. The beneficiaries are the people who your NGO was founded to serve. These are the people who are going to benefit from your programs. Finally, we don't usually talk about money and revenue as an objective for NGOs and NPOs, although a lot of times you do have to be making revenues and you might even charge for some of your programs. These can be more broad objectives, objectives to benefit society, not just to earn money. Let's look at a real-life example of how your NGO's programs and objectives fit in with your beneficiaries. A personal example for me is Hong Kong Dog Rescue. They've got a program to adopt dogs out to new owners. People like me and my dog Tempo, who I adopted about 5 years ago. What are the objectives for Hong Kong Dog Rescue's adoption program? In their annual report, they talk about 3 objectives for dogs. Number 1, to rescue the dogs. Number 2, to rehabilitate the dogs. And number 3, to rehome the dogs. When they talk about their overall objectives, this is an important part of their mission that they call their 3R mission: rescue, rehabilitate, and rehome. And education. We'll come back to that one in a minute. This is an example from Hong Kong Dog Rescue, one NGO in Hong Kong. As we talk about this example, also think about what programs and what objectives you have for your beneficiaries. So, Hong Kong Dog Rescue makes programs to benefit dogs like My Tempo with the idea that they want to rescue, rehabilitate, and rehome those dogs. So that's the dogs. What about people like me, the owners, the people who are adopting these dogs? Do they have programs and do they have objectives for people like me? Well, in their annual report, they talk about their objectives for the dogs. They also talk about objectives and programs for the community. So the dogs are one beneficiary group, and the community is another beneficiary group that has their own programs and their own objectives. So Hong Kong Dog Rescue actually has multiple beneficiaries, not just dogs, like it says in the name. Dogs are one beneficiary, and the objectives are to rescue and rehabilitate and rehome those dogs. The owners are a different beneficiary group. And for the owners, they're focusing on adoption and training. So Hong Kong Dog Rescue has objectives and programs for different beneficiaries. For the dogs, their programs have the objective to rescue, rehabilitate, and rehome the dogs. And for the owners, they have the objective of adoption and training. Now, the community is actually further divided in Hong Kong Dog Rescue's objectives. So they have a beneficiary of dog owners, people like me, but also beneficiary of students. So in fact, they have not just 2 beneficiaries, but 3 beneficiaries. Your NGO might have to think about multiple beneficiaries and how they balance out. How do owners relate to the dogs? How do students relate to dogs? Are students going to become owners? And how do these programs overlap? Another thing to think about is if your beneficiaries have indirect beneficiaries. An organization like Asian Charity Services is set up to benefit NGOs, and it has objectives and programs particularly for NGOs. But it serves NGOs in order to serve the community, and it has objectives for what they want to achieve in the community. Now, Asian Charity Services doesn't have programs for the community in general. They have programs to serve NPOs. But what would that look like? Because some NGOs also have objectives that serve multiple beneficiaries. This is another way to think about indirect beneficiaries. Think about your NGO and your beneficiaries. Are there any beneficiaries that you might be forgetting about because they're indirect beneficiaries? For example, if your NGO is educating children, what about the parents or the teachers? Are they affected by your work? And do you need to be communicating with those parents and those teachers to support those children better? So what about people like volunteers and donors? Are they beneficiaries that you want to communicate with also? Well, you do want to communicate with them, and ACS has a lot of programs for communicating with volunteers and donors. But it's a little bit different group than beneficiaries, and you might communicate with them differently. Oftentimes, we can think about the beneficiaries as the people who your NGO serves, and the donors, the volunteers, the board members, and the staff as the people who support your NGO. So what about your programs for your beneficiaries? How many programs do you have? How many do you need? Well, let's look at Hong Kong Dog Rescue one more time to see how they organize their programs for their beneficiaries to achieve their objectives. For dogs, they have rehoming centers and rehoming events. So we might simplify their programs for dogs to rehoming centers and rehoming events. What about owners? For dog owners, they have workshops, Positive Partners dog-human training courses, So we can say that they have these programs for their owners. What about students? Hong Kong Dog Rescue has educational talks and group visits for students. So when you put this all together, you can see Hong Kong Dog Rescue has a really well-organized structure of programs for dogs, programs for owners, and programs for students that are going to achieve their objectives for dogs, objectives for owners, and objectives for students. So for them, it's really clear who they need to communicate with. They need to talk to the owners, see how they're doing and what's working. They need to talk to students and see how they're engaging with their programs. And I don't know if they can talk to dogs, but they sure should try. One of the most powerful tools that we use in marketing is segmenting your beneficiaries and creating profiles for those beneficiaries. What might that look like for an organization like Hong Kong Dog Rescue? Well, they might separate those 3 beneficiaries into kind of typical profiles. And you might want to do this for your NGO as well. What would a typical dog look like with Hong Kong Dog Rescue? What's a typical owner? And what's a typical student? Think about what are the characteristics of one of these beneficiaries. What kind of programs do you have? And try to articulate what you want for those beneficiaries. How would you do this yourself? Your NGO should be thinking about your beneficiaries, your programs, and your objectives, and how those all fit together. Some of you have very mature strategies that include these. Some of you might just be starting out. Think about what programs you run for which beneficiary. Think about what those objectives are. And finally, think about the profiles of each of those beneficiaries. Having all of this mapped out in one place will really help you to communicate with those beneficiaries because you know which programs you need to talk to them about and what you're trying to get to together with those beneficiaries. Remember, communication is a two-way street. You need to be talking to them, but you also want to be listening to them, especially during this difficult COVID-19 period. So, in closing, now is a great time to talk to your beneficiaries. They feel uncertain and they want to know what's going on. They need to know about changes in your programs that are probably taking place during the changes around COVID. And you have a captive audience. So remember to think carefully about who your beneficiaries are, which programs each of them will care about, and what objectives you're trying to get to together. And also remember that communication is a two-way street. So even though it's tough right now during COVID, think about opportunities where you can talk to them and also listen to them about their experiences. Hopefully, with better communication, we can all get through this together.